This presentation, you'll be able to find this presentation very soon here before the week is over from Colorado Gifted. It's my pleasure to introduce Angelina Paolozza, and she's a research scientist at Multi Health Systems Incorporated. She completed her PhD in neuroscience at Queen's University, specializing in childhood development and developmental disorders. She also completed postdoctoral research at the University of Toronto, specializing in typical infant motor and cognitive development. Angelina has taught several courses at the University of Toronto. For 4 years, she has contributed to the development of psychometrically sound and scientifically validated measures for use in clinical and educational settings. So welcome, Angelina, for an introduction to addressing fairness in ability tests.
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I already had a wonderful introduction there. So I'll just say I work for a company called Multi Health Systems, and we develop neuropsychological assessments. And I want to talk to you today about how we can really pay attention to fairness in ability tests in gifted testing. But I'm going to use an ability test as an example, but I would like you to know that these principles are across all tests. So it also applies to rating scales, IQ tests, achievement measures. You can find these same fairness principles across all of them. And I'm going to kind of show you some of the things that are really important and that you can look for in the tests that are being given to your children, that you're giving to your students, ones that you're looking to research with. It has a whole host of applicable measures. So I'm going to start by giving a quick outline. So I'll give a quick overview of what is fairness, so we can kind of level set on that and what it relates to test development. We'll then walk you through some of the fairness related considerations. And I'm going to use a new test that we've developed at MHS called the Negliary General Ability Test. And I'm going to use that as an example for how we looked at research design and test content, psychometric evidence, delivery, training, and then I'll finish with a conclusion. So fairness is a critical consideration when developing a test for anything, for any neuropsychological disorder, for personality tests, for gifted, anything. Fairness should be a very important overarching thing that people look at. And generally in psychological testing, fairness will refer to considerations that are taken and evidence collected to ensure that a test is measuring and is sensitive to individual characteristics of the intended audience. So what that means is we want to ensure that how the test is taken and interpreted is the same across all relevant subgroups. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about subgroups or demographic groups, and I'll remind you what those mean, but basically it's like looking at gender. So do males perform differently from females? We look at ethnicity and races. So do white individuals perform differently from Asian or Hispanic or Black? And you'll see data on that I'm going to show you. So basically the test should reflect the same thing being measured across all the different test takers, not just one group of test takers. Why does this matter? Well, it's important for moral, ethical, and legal implications. If tests aren't developed in a manner that's considered to be fair, then it may lead to problems of underrepresentation that we see in gifted and talented education. So according to the standards, which is set out by the AERA, APA, and the NCME, which is what we use to guide all of our test development, it's a fundamental validity issue and requires attention throughout all stages of test development. And then finally, it also has legal ramifications in that it could lead to lawsuits for discrimination. So it's a really important thing that we really looked at from the beginning of conceptualizing our tests. So how do we look at it? Well, we address fairness through these 4 lenses. The first is the research design and test content. And I'm going to go through specific examples of these each and every one of them. So if you don't fully grasp it at this point, don't worry, I'm going to go into more detail. We then look at it in psychometric evidence, which I know for some who don't have a statistics background, that may sound scary, but I'm going to try my very best to break it down so that everybody can understand what I'm talking about and what psychometric evidence is and how you can examine it to look to see if a test is fair. Finally, there is delivery. So this is, how is the test delivered? How is it given? How is it accessed? And all the things that fall under that umbrella. And I'll go through more details of that as well. And then finally, training. So who can give the test? How should it be interpreted? Questions like that. So before I dive into these 4 things, I wanted to just level set and give you an introduction to the Negliary general ability test. So this is the ability test that we just developed. And I want to use it as an example as to how you can address fairness. So there are 3 tests: the Negliary General Abilities Test, verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative. And basically they can be used independently or in combination, and it provides students the opportunity to demonstrate their ability to solve problems from 3 different types of content. And I'll go through examples of these. So how can we do this? How can we construct a test and have it be guided by an emphasis on fairness? And what happens is if we can be fair, then what that translates to is more equitable identification. So we started by really just reading and reading and reading all the literature that was available for us to understand, why is there underrepresentation in gifted and what can we do to improve it? And a few common themes emerged when we did this. One is the use of English language. And that really did resonate quite a bit with a lot of groups, like, for example, English language learners, or individuals that have different levels of background knowledge, or individuals who come from, say, a university educated home where their parents are university educated versus one that comes from a home where their parents hadn't quite finished high school yet. You know, there's large gaps in the amount of prior knowledge that exists even based on that household. So when we looked into this, we really wanted to remove a lot of the prior knowledge as well as a lot of the English language. And the prior knowledge has also become particularly relevant today because of COVID. So studies are showing that kids are unequally being falling behind in school. So some are keeping up with the curriculum and learning everything, while others who, you know, may not have a stable internet connection at home, may not have a computer, these kids are falling behind and they're not learning the content. And so if they haven't learned it, how are they going to do well on this test? And how are they going to be able to do be fairly identified? And so in order to do that, we really were guided by trying to remove as much advanced academic knowledge as possible and minimizing that. So you're really just showing your reasoning ability and not having to rely on what you learned in school. We also removed verbal comprehension from the instructions, meaning that a lot of other tests may have lengthy 1-2 page instructions that have to be read through, either read to the students by the teacher or read by the students independently. Well, if you're an English language learner, how are you going to do well on a test if you can't fully comprehend what the instructions are? So we removed all of that from there. And I'll show you in a minute how we did that. The test items are also solvable using any language. So you can come from a different country, not speak any English, come here, and the idea is you can do just as well on this test, even if you don't have any English knowledge. And then verbal expression was also removed. So the items are answered using a multiple choice format. You don't have to say anything in order to answer the questions. So that first pillar I talked about was research design and test content. So tests, I didn't know this, even though I had actually given psychometric tests and psychological tests as part of my doctoral and postdoctoral work until I started working at MHS. I had no idea how long it takes to develop a test, but it takes a very long time. Minimum 5 years. Most of the time it's closer to 6, 7, and 8. And so really the development phase is quite lengthy, and publishers really do their due diligence to make sure that what they're measuring is what they intend to measure is what they're actually measuring. So kind of a little breakdown for you here. You know, this started in 2017 with looking at the development of the instructions and the test interface, item development, and then pilot testing. We did pilot testing, and I'll go through what that is, but basically there's 3 levels of testing that we did: pre-pilot, pilot, and then a final development phase in 2019. And one of the things that you focus on when you're collecting data is you want to make sure that your sample is representative of the entire US population. So what we do is we census match. And what that means is we look at the most recent US Census, and we make sure that we collect from across the entire country. So, you know, all the regions are represented, but then we go further and we make sure and we say, okay, if in the Northeast, there are, you know, 20% Hispanic individuals, then we make sure our sample is also 20% Hispanic. We make sure we have 50% males, 50% females. We also match on parental education levels. So if in that region, they have, you know, 15% of parents graduated high school, 15% of our population will also have graduated from high school. And so that's a way that we can ensure that, you know, we're not just testing wealthy kids from private schools or just one region, which is heavily dominated by a certain race or ethnicity. We want to make sure that what we collect is representative of the US. And so that's how we do that. So the first thing I mentioned was a focus on the instructions and the test interface. So what I mean by that is you can make your items as fair as you can, but if your individual or student doesn't understand how to complete the test, it doesn't matter how fair your items are, they're not going to do as well because they just can't comprehend that. And so that's where the instructions become really important when you're thinking about developing a test that's going to be as fair as possible. And then the test interface that's the way that the student interacts with the test. And so we have the instructions presented as an instructional video. It's 30 seconds, it has no language, and it also has no sound, meaning that children who have auditory deficits, who may be hard of hearing, or even we've had, you know, heard from schools who don't have headphones for every student and all of those things. Well, it's okay. They don't need that stuff because this is completely language free and it doesn't have any sound. Then there's practice items. So again, the goal is for the student to be able to work themselves through the instructions and the practice items, mainly because the less that the test administrator or the teacher needs to intervene using language to help them to understand, the more likely they are to understand it themselves working in any language. And so practice items were developed so that the student would click on an answer, and if it was the incorrect answer, the correct answer starts to flash. And that gives them the prompt to know, okay, it's actually not this, it's this. And they can learn going through several practice items, how to complete it by really looking at those and learning it that way. And we all know that there are students out there who are going to just like quickly go through and not care, or I'm guilty of it. Sometimes I don't read instructions. I just want to get to the good stuff. But we kind of force them to learn it because until they click the correct answer, they can't move forward to the next item on those practice screens. So that at least we're forcing them to really understand how to answer those first few questions before they move into the test. Now, once they hit the test, they can obviously have an incorrect answer and move on. All the different tests. So what I mean by all the different tests is across the 3: verbal, nonverbal, quantitative, as well as there's different grade forms. So, you know, we're obviously not going to give a kindergartner the same test as a grade 9 student, but across all of them, we try to keep things consistent. So they all have 40 items and they all have a time limit that's either 30 minutes for the younger kids or 35 minutes for the older kids. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to note actually is we also have the questions go from easier to harder. And why that's important is we know that testing is, it's very stressful for some kids. So having the questions start really easy allows them to build confidence before they get to the harder ones. And I really do think it makes a difference in how they're approaching and with test anxiety. So I'm going to first show an example of the instructional video. This is what it looks like for the verbal test. I'm going to play it. And it's literally as simple as that. As you can see, the video illustrates that 5 of the pictures share common verbal concept of fruit, while the chair does not. Now, what I want to point out here is that that concept of fruit could be said within one's head because no one has to write it down. No one has to say fruit. So you can reason through this using any language. You could say fruit in English, Spanish, Italian, any language under the sun you can use to reason because you don't actually have to use an English label in order to do the question. So that was the basis for the verbal test. This is where we worked with doctors Jack Negliary and Dina Brulez, and we wanted to make sure that we could use items that were universally recognized so that they could be appropriate across different cultures. And I'll go through an example later on in this presentation of where that actually becomes really important. The test questions require a student to understand the relationship among 6 pictures to determine which one doesn't share the concept by the other 5. So here is an example of kind of how that's accomplished. The student needs to understand that 5 of the pictures are objects that are empty. So that's your verbal term that you use to classify 5 of them, while the glass of orange juice does not fit the same verbal classification because it's a glass with juice in it. So it really does require the student to reason beyond just identifying what an item is, but also to come up with a relationship amongst them. The next test is the nonverbal. So this was done by Dr. Jack Negliary. It's comprised of questions that are presented using diagrams and pictorial formats. The questions require students to decipher the logic behind the relationships among shapes, colors, sequence, orientation to determine which of the 5 multiple choice questions completes the pattern. And here's an example here. So basically, all a student has to do is realize that the picture, the shape on the left is rotated 90 degrees clockwise to the right. So they just have to reason that number 1 would be the same pattern. So it's important to know that it's not necessary to describe the shapes, to use any verbal kind of language or labels to comprehend how it's done. You could, again, do this in any language. And then the final and third is the quantitative test. So this was done with Dr. Jack Negliary and Dr. Kimberly Lansdowne. And it's comprised of questions that are presented using numbers and shapes arranged in a pattern that's appropriate for use of that with children who are colorblind as well. And so was the nonverbal. The questions require the the student to examine the relationship, patterns and sequences among numbers and or symbols using basic math concepts. So where this is really important is I mentioned earlier that we're trying to remove as much academic and complicated knowledge from our items. And so this one, it becomes particularly important because we don't want to have random formulas for, let's say, the formula for a circle. That's really specific knowledge that you need to have in order to solve an item. So these items are all solvable using basic math. So the hardest question would have division in it, and that's it. So it's just addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. We were also sure to do our research and look across different countries and different curriculums to make sure that a student would have learned division before they saw a question that had it in it. And so here's one of the examples. So here, the student needs to first eliminate the shapes on both sides. So you would need to eliminate kind of the hexagons here on either side to realize that 2 parallelograms equal 2 circles. Therefore, 1 circle must equal 1 parallelogram. Now, this is kind of a fun way of looking at math because it doesn't look very scary. But what they're actually doing is they're solving for X using equations. But they're doing it in a way that's using shapes and they're fun colors and they sit on a teeter-totter. And so it really becomes less scary for the students as they're trying to do these tests. So I mentioned that it goes through many different data collection efforts and many different studies in order to make sure that we're arriving at the best items that the students will then see. And so one of the ways we do that is we do multiple rounds of testing. The first is pilot and pre-pilot testing. And so what we do is, again, we give a large group of students who are matched to the US Census the tests. And we start with more questions than we need because we know that every single question we write is not going to be an amazing question. So we know that we need to start with a large pool and then we can whittle down to the best ones based on all these rounds of testing. So what we look for to know an item isn't very good or might need to be revised is we look for a few key things. The first is duplication of an item difficulty. What that means is that if I mentioned that we have, we go from easy to hard. If we have too many easy items and not enough hard items, we're not going to get at those gifted kids. And if we have too many hard items and not enough easy items, we're going to stress them out. So what we do is we want to have that nice range. And so we look to see, do we have too many hard? Do we have too many easy? Do we need to get rid of a few to make it a better progression? The next is problematic distractors. So we look for 2 things with this. The first is we look to see, could there be an alternative answer that is correct? And that one was, the verbal was kind of particularly hard in that one because it had so many different things. And so gifted kids sometimes could see an alternative answer that we didn't see originally. So we look to make sure that we have only one correct answer for each and every item. The other thing we look for is a distractor is meant to distract. So if we have nobody that chooses one of the options, it's obviously not a very good distractor. So we would eliminate that because we at least want a few people to be distracted by that option, or else you might as well not have that option there. And now it's out of 4 options instead of out of 5, which actually makes guessing a little bit easier. So we really want to make sure we have 5 good options there, and 4 of the 5 are good distractors. We also look for an unusually slow response time. So we want to make sure that they can get through the questions in the time that's allotted. And we also want to try to keep the time as short as possible for them because they don't want to be sitting through a 3-hour test. So anything that took a really long time for the kids to do, we eliminated it. We also look for group differences in terms of, males versus females, so gender, parental education level, and race and ethnicity. We didn't actually find any, but we did look for it and would have used it if we needed to remove an item. And then obviously this is a gifted test. So we looked at gifted versus general population to make sure we were actually distinguishing the 2. So I want to show you some actual items that we cut and kind of go through why we cut them. So this was an item from the nonverbal test that we ended up removing. And we did that because 100% of the people answered it correctly. So it was just too easy of an item. So we removed it because we already had enough easy items on that test. And so it was just kind of an easy call. We don't need that one. This one is the opposite end of the spectrum. This one was just too difficult. Even the oldest students, even the gifted students, took a really long time to solve this item. And it's because the pattern behind it was slightly different from what the other number line items looked like. And so for that reason, we removed it, because we don't want people sitting there for 4 minutes trying to solve one item when they only have a 35-minute time limit. So once it goes through those rounds, then it goes through this last final test development. And the importance of this last phase is that when we do the pilot and the pre-pilot, and we're trying to make sure we're perfectly matched and all of that, we actually use a data collection company, and they go out and they find the people for us. But when we do this final test development, we wanted to make sure we went into the schools with real teachers as the test administrators, giving the test, so we can make sure that when it's used in the way it's intended to be used in the classroom in large groups, that we were going to see the same results. And so that's what that final test development phase is here. And so we looked again at the same things. Do we have the right levels of difficulty? Do we have overlap of items across different grades, which is what you actually want, and other ability tests have. And what that means is, some of the items that were on the grade 1 test are also on the grade 2 test. So you can kind of see how they both perform. And then we also wanted to keep the test time under the 35 minutes for the reasons I talked about earlier. Then the verbal gave us a bit of a harder time. So that one we paid special attention to, and we removed a distractor if it was endorsed, even if we didn't know why it was endorsed. So sometimes with these things, kids will just answer what they want to answer. And so we would find weird things, like younger kids will choose a book if there's a book there. We don't know why, we have no idea, but if there's a book in the item, they're going to choose the book, whether it's the right answer or not. So for that reason, we would just remove those, because we just didn't want it to be too distracting so that everyone was getting it incorrect. And then also we removed it if the items had specific content knowledge. So we did an additional review to kind of see, did this require you to know any sort of specific scientific knowledge or anything really specific? We wanted to remove that because we wanted it to be, for curriculum and advanced knowledge to be removed. Okay, now I'm going to go through the psychometric evidence. That's our second pillar. This one, again, can sound scary, but I'm going to try my very best to make it understandable. So there's 2 pieces of evidence that we can look for when we're analyzing that data that we collected. The first is called measurement invariance, and that we can use tests called differential item functioning and differential test functioning. And I'll go through what those are. And then we also look at the intended use and the outcomes. So the measurement invariance is really looking at the test itself. And then the use and outcomes is looking at how individuals perform on that test, because you could have a really fair test and still have it be used incorrectly. And so we wanted to cover both bases. So differential item functioning sounds scary, and I had never heard of it even before I had come into this job. But basically what it is it wants to make sure that the test is measuring the same thing across different individuals. So this is kind of an analogy using a ruler and a ball. So here you can see if my ruler is the same, then I can measure the diameters of the balls and I can compare them to each other. I can see that the soccer ball is the same diameter as the basketball, but the beach ball is bigger and the cue ball is smaller. The ruler, imagine this scenario, is your test, and the balls are your students. So you want to make sure your students, let's say male versus female, let's say the females were the soccer balls and the males were the basketballs, they should be the same. And so you want to be able to make sure that your ruler is the same. And that's what measurement invariance is. If you don't have measurement invariance, then what you're going to have is your test is going to measure each and every group differently. So One ball is going to be measured based on one ruler and another by a different one. And so now, because you don't have measurement and variance, you can't really compare across the different groups because they're not measuring the same thing. And so we can statistically look at that with our tests to make sure we're measuring the same thing in our different groups. And so one of the ways we do that is we look at it and we look at gender. So males and females, are they performing the same? Race and ethnicity, as well as parental education level. And I want to show you an example of one of the items that we cut and why we did that. So this is an item from the verbal test. The idea behind it is a little bit of a harder one. The idea behind it is these are things that come from other things. So gas comes from oil, orange juice comes from an orange, a log cabin comes from logs, so on and so forth. The sixth option is the answer because cookies don't come from milk, they just go with milk. So this item we thought was fairly straightforward, but when we analyze the data, we can see that the males and the females perform differently. And so what I'll show you here is this is the score, and then this line is our males and this line is our females. So the males are doing slightly better than the females. And that's not what we want to see. We want to see the lines perfectly overlapping each other, meaning that they're measuring the same thing across both of the genders. So for that reason, we removed this. I still don't know why it showed it, but it did. We have a few theories, but nothing conclusive. So once we look at each and every item on each and every test, we then look at the test as a whole. And so that's what we're showing here. So the differential test functioning is the ability to look at all the items together and how our different groups will perform on each one of those. And again, we're looking for that perfect overlap. And then the second one, which is our mean group differences. So once we've decided, yes, our test isn't showing any sort of biases, we have that measurement and variance. Now we want to make sure that we're seeing that in real time with real students taking the test. And that's what we did here. We did research studies where we had large groups, like 6,518 students across the US who completed the test. And then we wanted to look at their data. And so what you can see here is this is their score by race and ethnic groups. We looked at Hispanic, Black, and white. We're currently looking at a Native American sample. And right now we're not seeing much of a difference, but we're still waiting to get a few more people because you need quite a large group to run those tests I talked about earlier with the differential test functioning. So you can see here that, they're performing relatively the same across all the different grades. This one is for the quantitative, and this is an example. And we ran this for all sorts of things. I just don't have enough time to go through all of them. Happy to send you an overview paper we wrote, though, with all that in there. This is an example of the parental education level. So you can see we had less than high school, some college, bachelor's, and graduate. And you can see here that, again, they're performing relatively the same across all the different education levels. And then we also looked at gender for each one of these things. And again, you can see males and females are performing relatively the same across all the different forms. Okay, so next is accessibility. So we want to look at how the test is delivered or it's accessed. All test takers should have an unobstructed opportunity to demonstrate how they do in a construct that's being measured. And so we looked at this in 3 different ways: availability and accommodations for students, cultural sensitivity, and use of language. So I won't go through all of these because I know I'm nearing the end, but basically we wanted to make sure that children with visual deficits, including color blindness, could write the tests, people with individualized education programs, anyone with a motor challenge, and anyone with auditory deficits. It's appropriate for all of these groups. Next, the use of language. So again, there's a large population that are English language learners, and we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to them just as easily as it would be for someone who speaks English as their native language. And so we did that again by removing the instructions or language from the instructions. We use minimal language when the teacher is administering the test. So there is still some language, but it's really on how to interact with the test interface. So the teacher doesn't explain anything to the students. They just say things like, push the play button to see the video, or click the next arrow, very basic things. And that we've already translated to Spanish, and it's fairly easy to translate to any other language as well. And then also across all three tests, we want to make sure that the questions had no language. Cultural sensitivity. So this was a really interesting one that had to do with the verbal test specifically. And it's because, you know, the nonverbals and the quant are just numbers and shapes. That's universal across all countries. Whereas the verbal has a lot of things built into it that we wanted to make sure. And so we had cultural experts from around the world examine the items and flag them. And they found stuff that we would have never thought of. So here's a perfect example. One of them flagged this, and, you know, I wouldn't have seen anything wrong with it, but the fire hydrant is not a universally recognized item for anyone outside of North America. So this is what fire hydrants look like in other parts of the world. And so a student who was from these other countries wouldn't be able to understand this item simply because they don't recognize what a fire hydrant is. So for that reason, these items that were like this were removed from the test. Okay, the last pillar is training. So training is a critical consideration because regardless of how the test is measured, we could make it the most fair test in the world. And if it's not given in the appropriate way, then it won't be or interpreted in the appropriate way, then it makes the results invalid. And so ways that we can accomplish this is, you know, clearly defining its intended use, what it can and cannot do. People need to know that one test is not going to be the answer for all inequality. So what can this test do and how can it help with that is an important thing to lay out from the beginning and really describe. And then also outline what defines a qualified individual when administering and interpreting these scores. So we actually have, with this test specifically, two different types of qualified individuals. So the test itself can be administered in a group with a classroom teacher. So it requires much less training in order to give the test. Other tests, you know, for example, an IQ test needs to be given by a different qualification. So it needs to be usually given by a school psychologist, someone who has a graduate degree in test measurement and that sort of thing, versus this one can be done by a classroom teacher or even a teacher's aide if you give them the proper training. And so as long as they become familiar with the instructions and the procedures, read through the manual, it can really be done by a larger pool of individuals than other tests. A different story is those that are interpreting the scores. So a classroom teacher can go out there and they can give the test, but people who are making decisions on the scores themselves need to have a different level of qualification. And mainly that's in statistics. So, you know, we provide all different types of scores, standard scores, percentile ranks, stanines. And so in order for someone to properly understand and interpret those to make the decisions, they need to understand what those are. And it could be a classroom teacher. I'm not saying a classroom teacher doesn't know what a percentile rank or a standard score is, but there are more specific qualifications that we lay out. And that's just us being really careful to make sure that these life-altering decisions are being done in a way that we can be sure are correct. Okay, now I'm just going to conclude. So here's those pillars again, and I'm just going to go through really quickly kind of what they are and then just summarizing it. So we talked about how in the case of developing a general ability test, things like reducing the demand for advanced academic knowledge, removing the need for verbal comprehension in the instructions and verbal expression from the responses, and then the importance of matching your sample to who is going to be actually writing the tests. For psychometric evidence, we looked at both the measurement invariance and then also looking for a lack of mean group differences. So making sure that the average scores of males and females do not differ from one another. And it becomes very critical that understanding these two types of information can tell you about the test, what it is, and more importantly, tells you about what it can and cannot do and how fair it is. And you need both of these pieces of information to know that it's fair. You can't just take one or the other. It's really important that you have both. And delivery. So this one is often, people don't pay a lot of attention to how a test is designed and delivered, but ultimately it does impact all students and their ability. And so we need them to, appropriately gain access to the test and be able to complete it in the same way, or in a way that is, even with accommodations, just the way that they're most comfortable and can do their best. And, that includes the colorblindness, being able to take breaks, all sorts of things like that. And then lastly, training. So we have clearly defined, uses and the different qualifications for the test administrator or the person interpreting the scores. So as long as that's followed, you can make sure that the test is given in a way that is as fair as possible. And that's it.
Thank you so much. As somebody who's been on the end of administering thousands and thousands and thousands of tests, it's very interesting to me. And this presentation will be very popular on the recordings as gifted facilitators and gifted resource teachers everywhere look to increase equity and opportunity in their school district. There's I'm in my fourth decade of education, and the talk around equity, and rightfully so, has never been stronger than it is right now. And so, I just want to, if you could, one more time, just very briefly, why do we take language out of a test to increase equity?
Great question. So the reason why that's going to increase equity is because you're going to have some students who are ELL especially, or ones that may not know have as high of a vocabulary. Like, studies are actually showing that kids who come from households where parents graduated high school versus ones where their parents graduated from university have a 3 million word gap. And so even vocabulary and knowing more words are going to allow you to read through instructions and understand them differently than somebody else. But those ELL students, some programs don't even allow them to take the test. I mean, we have worked with districts where, I'm not kidding you, if you're an English language learner, you're not allowed to take a gifted test because they don't have anything that's appropriate for you. And so that you're obviously going to have underrepresentation in these individuals. And, those that have lower socioeconomic status, or kids who, have private tutors who can teach them how to do these things, as opposed to those, all of that relates to this underrepresentation.
Thank you. There seems to be 30 minutes seems to be this magic number with all the different kind of tests I've administered. Is there some magic in that number, in that 30-minute or 40-minute test window?
I think it's just that's a person's attention span, right? And especially when you have a test that goes from easier to harder, you really don't want that person to be mentally exhausted by the time they get to those harder questions. And so it's this balance of being able to get the most amount of information about the children's ability, as well as do it as efficiently as possible. And so I had fun playing with this data, but we actually collected the data and we gave kids longer and we gave kids shorter. And we tried to see, are their scores different if we give them 35 minutes, 45 minutes, those sorts of things. And with the 40 items we chose, we didn't see any difference there. So it gave us a good idea that, we had some items in there that were probably redundant. If we cut those out, we can really get down to the same accuracy level with less items.
And then I assume too that because you can extend time for students with disabilities, for example, that studies were done to see just what effect that has.
Yes. So we did do studies to see, if you gave them all the time in the world, are they going to do that much better? They don't. It's generally those kids. Now, that's not with the ones with accommodations. They actually do benefit from having that more time there. And you will see that the ones that really want to be methodical and go through it and need that time and need the constant breaks, then they get the longer time and they can do similar to their peers who don't have accommodations.
Early on, a couple of the viewers had a similar theme in question, and I'm pretty sure that you answered it later on, but just in case it was missed, that they had questions about that initial screening process for questions, and particularly in the verbal part, right? That were the various groups, were the various stakeholders who would be taking the test, like Indigenous groups, for example, were they consulted in the development of those questions?
Yes, so they were. So we would, we had this large cultural review that went underway. And then we had these reviewers who are experts, they are professors in culture. They are advocates for underrepresentation. They represent a whole host of different races and ethnicity, cultural backgrounds, all sorts of things. Like we chose that so that we had a wide variety. And so what they would do is they would flag an item, but we would then ask them, okay, could you think of something that would be better in that place that we could use instead of that? And so they would help us with those things. And I mean, we actually even used the kids' feedback for our items, especially on the verbal. So, we had a bunch of kids that got an item wrong and we asked them, why didn't you get it wrong? It had a flashlight in it. And they said, well, we don't know what this is. And we're like, you don't know what a flashlight is? And they say, no, is that the thing that my mom uses her cell phone for? So it was just outdated technology at this point, which sounds crazy, but we were even using the kids' help in trying to develop these so that we could make sure that they understand what they're seeing.
And were the children who were sought in reviewing the questions also from the various groups? Yeah.
We had smaller groups for that. Obviously, we can't go out there with all of them, but yes, we had smaller groups for that. We also had a lot of gifted kids. So we had gifted kids in their programs really helping us with this as well, because like I said, they think differently. So they're seeing stuff that we're not seeing.
And you talked about the test as a whole being normed and established. What about the relationship between the verbal and the quantitative and the nonverbal scores? Should they all be coming out about, at the same, obviously there's some sort of average across all of those as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So we did look and there were correlations between them. So if they're doing well on the verbal, they're also likely doing well in the nonverbal and quantitative. And then we also provide scores on the total scores across 2 or 3 of the tests. So if the kids take 2 or 3 of the tests, they'll get a total score. And what that looks at is it actually doesn't just simply take the average of all 3 tests, because you could do that. What we do is we take it one step further where we average them, but then we also look at their performance in comparison to their peers. So if, for example, they did really well across all 3 tests, they may have a higher score than someone who does really well in 1, but then poorer in 2. Or it could even depend on so if everybody in the class does, or everyone in the district does really well on the 3 tests, then they're going to get more of an average. But if the district as a whole does poorly on two of the tests, but they do really well on all three, it actually bumps their score up a little bit because it makes it that much more impressive that they did well on all three.
And maybe you don't have enough data yet, but do you see different regions doing comparatively better on different sections of the test? Like a region, for example, the Northeast is scoring higher on the verbal than the West. Do you see that sort of thing happening?
We have looked at that. We found it in, I think it was the pre-pilot, but that was a smaller sample where we found that the West did a little bit better than the Northeast, the Midwest, or the South. We don't really know why. It could have just been like a fluke because, you have smaller amounts of kids. We didn't really see that pattern hold up across all of them, but in that one sample, it was on all three tests that those kids just did better for some reason. But it's not anything that's pervasive. And if it was, it really does, though, point to the importance of local norms. I've seen real live district data where we have some districts that blow me away in how well all the kids do across the board. And then I've seen others where, their highest achieving kids are getting, sometimes 55% on the test, like, 25 of the 40 items correct. And that's the highest achieving kids. So it really does vary more so by district than I would say by a specific regions.
And we have time for one more question, and it's a question about disabilities. Mm-hmm. What about a student with dysgraphia or dyslexia? How is the test accessible to those students?
So I'm going to be honest, we haven't specifically studied that. Dyslexia, I don't think, because there's no verbal instructions, there's nothing they have to read. The quantitative might be a little harder for them because of the numbers, like maybe the number line might be a little harder for them to read, but I can't see any reason why the verbal and the nonverbal wouldn't be just as appropriate for them as any other test. The only one, if I were to study it, the only one I would maybe flag as potential is the quantitative, but like I said, we never actually specifically looked at that yet, but it's a good study.
Well, Angelina, it's so nice that that you spent some time with us talking about how these tests are normed, how the good work that the Negliary people are doing to try to make the tests as equitable as possible. I would just note for any of our listeners out there that the Negliary test of nonverbal abilities, which is a different test, is widely recognized by those who are most interested in equity and education as the standard. And we use it in our district, and it's used in many districts. And so it's wonderful to see the kind of work that goes into figuring out how we can give access to the most students that we can, that we can possibly give access to all students to gifted programming and set standards and equity. And so thank you so much for your insight tonight. These are things that we don't typically know. Even being 40 years in gifted education and giving thousands and thousands of tests, these are things that we typically don't know. So thank you so much.
Thank you.